investing in the North, whereas the North has traditionally been seen to be kind of left behind, where all investment has gone to London and the South East. That really appealed to people. And you've gone from that to where we are now, which is we're really narrowing down who we could possibly, or who they rather, could possibly appeal to, at the time that Labour are really opening up to who they could appeal to, and the Lib Dems are as well. It seems like a poor strategic move.
Welcome back to the Veterans in Politics podcast with our special feature, Behind the Politics, and we have got Lydia back again to talk all about Conservative Party conference. And this follows up from last week's episode where we got deep into the Lib Dems, and of course next week we will look at Labour. But for now, we're going to look at the blue team. Been quite a week for the Conservative Party, has it not, Lydia?
It has. There's been somewhat of a media frenzy around who was inside and who was outside of conference. So we heard of a long-standing member being thrown out for some heckling, and yet at the same time the party seemed to be welcoming with open arms Nigel Farage into their number.
Yes. So I think we're going to dive into that during this episode for sure. We're going to look at the big issue of the day, which has dominated party conference, and that is HS2. Now, we should declare an interest. First up is that my little brother works for a large construction company on HS2 in Birmingham. And secondly, you had a bit of an association with HS2, did you not?
I did, yes. I worked for them a few years ago.
And what was your role at HS2?
I was a community engagement manager. So my job was to go out into the communities and explain what was happening and answer any questions. So I had to gain a very quick, deep knowledge of construction and the rail industry.
Well, of course, you married the family of a builder, so you knew all about construction. But you were fighting off lots of pitchforks, angry people,
Yep.
people whose homes, in all seriousness, have been compulsory purchased by HS2 and the government.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And HS2 is one of those very emotive projects, especially in, the Shire counties. It runs, or is due to run, from London to Birmingham, so obviously it goes through what is known as prime Conservative heartlands. And the project was obviously announced by David Cameron and George Osborne back in the day, and we're just about onto construction, I believe. But yes, there were a lot of very upset people. Naturally, it is going to make a huge change to the kind of countryside, and an impact on those people who live and work there.
And after Rishi's speech at the end of party conference, everyone has taken to Twitter, no less David Cameron, who you mentioned, who was the architect behind HS2, big supporter, and he is incandescent about Rishi Sunak's announcement on HS2. So we're going to go into a bit of depth around there. But I would say for any of us that listen to this podcast, I do urge you to hit that subscribe button because that helps us grow the show. And for those of you who are feeling a little bit more generous, you can go in the show notes and become one of our supporters for the cost of about a millimetre of HS2 train track a month. You can become one of our supporters to the show to keep this going. So yeah, for about minimum of about £3 a month, that really helps us. And for those of you that are interested, we're on YouTube, where all the kids, cool kids, hang out. And essentially we're on our sofa in our front room. So
Yep.
we are becoming a little bit of a goggle box set up here in our home when we do this Behind the Politics feature. I mean, on Gogglebox, who's your favourite couple?
Mary and Giles, hands down.
Next question, who we most like?
Mary and Giles.
Mary and Giles, okay, nutty. So yeah, big fans of Gogglebox out there. So Channel 4, if you're listening, yeah, if you've got a vacancy, sign us up. If you want a couple of political geeks as an extra feature, Northamptonshire is not represented, so just saying, come on, levelling up and all that. So let's crack on with, you mentioned earlier on as well, there were some people in the conference and some people out. Now, I find it absolutely extraordinary having listened and witnessed the situation where we had the chair of the Greater London Conservatives in City Hall evicted, manhandled by the police and security out of conference for apparently heckling Suella Braverman in her speech. It was a very British rumble, a grumble, I should say. Now, listen to him on LBC this morning, the day after the night before. He'd been to a remarkable 47 Conservative conferences. He then tweeted a picture of his conference lanyard, minus the pass, because they'd taken it off of him. And the way in which he handled himself in that interview was full of dignity and grace. I don't necessarily agree with all of Andrew Boff's ideology or outlook on politics, but you cannot question his loyalty to the Conservative Party. And I find it extraordinary that we're in a situation where you've got a former Home Secretary in Priti Patel dancing the night away with Nigel Farage, who have made a career out of destroying the Conservative Party, cost the Conservative Party votes over numerous elections that you and I have run personally. Yep. But he's welcome, apparently welcome, but a loyalist of 47 conferences like Andrew Boff is not. What is that all about?
Good question.
That's why I asked it.
Who knows? Who knows? I can only assume that this is kind of indicative of the party's jump to the right. And if you look at things that have been reported on this week from the conference, particularly Suella Braverman's speech, there is definitely a move to the right, which is very interesting timing, because normally political parties move right or left after they've lost an election. So we saw the Labour Party move to the left under Jeremy Corbyn, and we're now seeing the Conservative Party moving to the right under Rishi Sunak. And that is possibly the only explanation I have for why they seem to have flung open the doors to Nigel Farage. I think it's an odd choice of person to allow into your conference. I understand that he had a few speaking events, but he had a pass like anybody else, and I suppose you can apply for a pass, whether it was a media pass as he's working for GB News, or whether it was, him as a private individual, I don't know. But he does, especially off the back of all of this debanking, he does seem to be being held up by the right as some kind of icon.
And some kind of hero. And I think it's completely overcooked that Brexit and the result of Brexit there's too much owed to Nigel Farage, quite frankly.
I agree.
And how he gets lauded up as this kind of, without Nigel Farage it wouldn't have happened, is completely nonsense. But you've been round Nigel Farage's flat, have you not?
Yes.
When you worked in Brussels, come on, all your secrets coming out now. I remember sat there, brave service person there, preparing to go to Afghanistan, working hard, learning my language before deploying operations, lots of military training and fitness, and there you are, lording it up around Nigel Farage's flat. What's that?
I mean,
what happened there?
A, I was not there by myself, I should highlight. B, there was no lording up to happen. My boss at the time, Roger Helmer, very fond of him, but he was invited to drinks at Nigel's house, and I was asked to go along. And it was, as you'd expect, a room full of smoke and a lot of booze, and that was pretty much the start and end of it, I think.
So he lives up to the caricature of Nigel Farage. I've not met the bloke.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
There you go. That was a big scoop.
He was very polite.
Okay, all right. I won't be too mean. I just find the juxtaposition that the Conservative Party's in at the moment pretty extraordinary. And you mentioned Corbyn earlier, and on a group that I'm in with some other veterans in politics, one of my very, very good friends, who is a Labour Party member, simply replied back when it came to the Andrew Boff thing, and I was like, what's this all about? He was like, welcome to the Conservative Corbynista times.
Yeah.
So he seems to equate what they went through as a party with what the Conservative Party are going through at the moment, and this lurch to a particular faction of a political audience.
And I would agree with that. Islamisation as well. And the timing of it is unusual because, as we've said, normally this only happens when you've lost an election and you're kind of doing your navel-gazing bit. It's very unusual for it to happen whilst you're still in power. And, you know, is this a sign of things to come? Quite possibly. And
it's the polar opposite of what we've experienced in the past with Boris. So Boris, huge election winner, wide appeal, didn't particularly appeal to one particular faction of the Conservative Party, but appealed to many. And we know, and by that token, appealed to many people in the country, up and down the line of HS2, left and right of it.
I think it's fair to say that since the 90s, every political party has been vying for the centre ground. You have the Conservatives under David Cameron that were centre-right, and Labour are traditionally centre-left. And it's the centre where all the votes are, because most people aren't hugely binary in all of their kind of decision-making and outlook on life. There is grey in the mix. And so placing yourself slightly to the right or slightly to the left of centre means actually you are going to pick up a lot more votes. By shunting yourself to the right, as the Conservatives have just done, you no longer have broad appeal, you no longer have mass appeal. You're turning off a lot of the electorate that, as you say, were previously there under Boris. Look at the Red Wall, for example. I know, you know, traditional media seem to think it's a bit of a phenomena, but actually dig down into the policies that he was, you know, selling at the time, linking up the north. Obviously this hits back at Rishi's announcement today on HS2, but talking about railway links, better transport in the north, investing in the north, whereas the north has traditionally been seen to be kind of left behind, where all investment has gone to London and the southeast. That really appealed to people. And you've gone from that to where we are now, which is we're really narrowing down who we could possibly, or who they rather, could possibly appeal to, at the time that Labour are really opening up to who they could appeal to, and the Lib Dems are as well. It seems like a poor strategic move.
Yeah, and that appeal to the north obviously appealed to northerners, but also I think people that don't live in the north, they liked that, the fact that Boris made the effort and that levelling up phrase and the way that he wanted to link north and south, symbolised through HS2. People down south also related to that and liked and appreciated that. So it's interesting times for the Conservative Party. We have seen that strategy in the past of lurching to one particular faction, left or right, doesn't particularly pan out too well for political parties. It's very interesting to hear the language as well. And what, again, another thing that frustrated me about this conference, having met a lot of MPs recently through the podcast, many of which personally knew people like Sir David Amess, who, and I'm very careful about how I position what I'm about to say, because an MP lost his life in horrific attack and crime. But quite rightly, there was outrage from MPs about some of the stuff around the language that's used in politics. That doesn't excuse the person that did that and murdered Sir David. It was horrific. But I think, therefore, you think we would have learnt something around what language we use in our politics. And I've just found that some of the language is very inflammatory, and people aren't taking responsibility for the language, those that they should be in politics. But they will be the first people to come out when something horrible happens to then criticise others about their use of language when they're doing it themselves. So I've found that's quite disturbing, if I'm honest, this week with the Conservatives, a party you and I both used to work for day in, day out. And the other thing is that you can't get a fag packet between GB News and the Conservative Party at the moment. And no. in fact, some Conservative MPs work for GB News as well, at least 4 as well, which is, again, remarkable, including the Vice Chairman of the Conservative Party. Big fan of you, Lee, by the way. So it's quite difficult to, therefore, see some kind of impartiality when it comes to the media and political parties. And, I feel very strongly about this, because I just don't think the two equate to good democracy.
Well, it breaks the separation of powers, doesn't it?
It
that
does.
Traditionally we have in this country.
Yeah.
It completely goes against that.
And again, jumping up and down about cancel culture and this, this war on culture that's they've been dreaming up, the political classes, the reality of it in everyday lives. Do we really notice that or care that? Probably not. But that whole notion linked to the current story around GB News and people calling for it to be, closed down. I don't subscribe to that. Absolutely not. I believe in the free press. But the same people who are coming out in support of GB News are the same people that are quite happy to see one of their own evicted from their own conference for having a view.
It's a dead cat, isn't it?
What is?
The whole this war on woke. It's the dead cat in the room, and by that I mean you throw a dead cat in to kind of catch people's attention, make people angry about something, and really focus on that one thing. Whilst everything else is going wrong over here, but no one can see it because they're too busy looking at the dead cat. And I genuinely think that's what it is. And it's a shame that it's got to the level that it has.
Well, where do they go from here? Well, where they say they're going to go is all about the long term. And this that was the slogan for Conservative Party.
Long-term decisions for a brighter future.
Yeah, I'm sure we're all feeling very bright about the future off the back of the conference. And let's have a little look at Rishi's speech as well, because we both sat down and listened to that together. There was we had some curious, supporting acts, let's just call them. We had Penny Mordaunt, Johnny Mercer, and Mrs. Rishi Sunak as well, who has had her own difficulties with the press and the opposition, certainly, in recent times. It was a curious choice. I mean, we know and love Johnny Mercer a lot on this show, previous guest of the show, episode 1, just saying, and has done an enormous amount to change the narrative around veterans in this country. It was a curious choice, therefore, to roll out Johnny Mercer, don't you think? Why did they do that?
If you listen to the content of his speech, he repeats values and service throughout it. All of the achievements that he has made obviously were hanging around it, but values and service. And at the end, he said, we all need to hang in together, which I think is a bit of a call for unity. There hasn't been any implication up to this point, I don't believe, that there is disunity within the parliamentary ranks, but there's always going to be something bubbling away in the background. I think a few cabinet ministers made their pitch for PM this week as well, so perhaps that's off the back of that. But I think Johnny did a really good speech, solid, very well presented, used humour well, and came across really well. We then moved on to Rishi's wife, who again actually did a great speech, but what she was doing was introducing us to her husband, who just happens to be the Prime Minister. And why is she doing that? Because nobody knows who he is. We've had, a series of different leaders since, 2019 even, when Boris was selected. And obviously in the Conservative Party, it goes out to the party membership, and it's exclusively the MPs that whittle down those people that wish to be leader. They whittle it down to 2, and then that goes out for a vote amongst all party members. And Liz Truss was elected. Not the choice of the parliamentarians, their choice was Rishi, but Liz got elected, and then we all know how that ended. And so I feel like the intro from Mrs. Sunak was both for internal members, this is who my husband is. He's a fun guy, he doesn't just wear hoodies and short trousers, this is what he's about, he's a dad, he's got values, he's aspirational. She said that quite a lot. and also to the wider general public. You know, the public don't know who he is. During the pandemic, he was the Chancellor, kind of kept a low profile, really, because it was mainly about Boris and Matt Hancock. Rishi had a bit to do, like
Rishi's dishes.
Yeah, Rishi's dishes, and he's out to help out. But other than that, he kind of went under the radar. So people don't really know who he is. So it was a good way of introducing him, and a personal way as well. And actually it demonstrated that political wives, or the wives of the PM, or husbands of the PM, are not just there to grin and grab, and by that I mean the smile and handshake, and just be kind of arm candy for their intellectual superior. She actually stood there and gave a really good, well thought out speech about her husband.
I mean, who on earth would roll out their wives to do an introduction for a bit of talking? I mean, what idiot would do that? But in all seriousness, it's been done before, hasn't it, by a previous Prime Minister?
Yes, Sarah Brown introduced Gordon Brown. He went on to lose the election. I'm not saying that would be what happens here, but it wasn't a good omen. But he was in a similar position. Obviously, he took over from Tony Blair. That was far simpler than the farce that the Conservative Party's been through. It was literally Tony Blair stood down, Gordon Brown was the replacement. And so it's always difficult if you've kind of been in a backroom role. Of course, Gordon Brown wasn't in a backroom role. Being Chancellor is a big deal, and he was a Chancellor for a phenomenal amount of time. But it's difficult when you're seen being one thing and then suddenly you're taking on the big job, and people need to look at you in a different way. You know, as a Chancellor, you've got to be very meticulous with accounting, I would imagine, and really on the ball and quite serious. And Gordon Brown was always complained about being quite a dour person, and suddenly you've got to appeal to a heck of a lot of people in order to keep your job.
Similar parallels there then between Rishi and Gordon, both former chancellors, both followed very charismatic prime ministers in Tony Blair and Boris, and both brought out their wives, both similar style managers rather than leaders. So perhaps the fate will be similar too. We will wait and see. So let's look at what was said in the Sunak speech. Excuse me. Let's dive back into HS2 then, shall we?
Yes.
I mean, it was probably the worst kept secret in conference politics. We all knew it was going to happen. Every minister that was rolled out in the press was asked about it, and everyone skirted around the issue, etc. And we all knew that it was going to be saved for Rishi's speech. And surprise, surprise, the announcement that HS2, in effect, is going to be cancelled in the original plan from Birmingham to Manchester was announced, to the uproar of northern politicians. Andy Burnham's been out on the stump a lot. Who, you know, a really good communicator. It's been an absolute gift for him. And we've also seen Twitter come alive. Experts like Simon Calder, the travel man, he's come out and debunked one of the kind of sweeteners that was presented today, that the reallocation of 36 billion, the savings were going to be reallocated elsewhere in the north. And he came out and said, well, actually, one of the things around connecting Manchester to Bradford, it's the service is already there, and if they're going to go 5 times, as said in the speech, more services per hour, that mean there'll be a train every 3 minutes. So he's already debunked that. And then we've had Manchester local newspaper talk about the promise of extending the metro line to the airport. That was done in 2014. So the whole mitigation around HS2 and the reallocation of funds hasn't gone too well, despite its best intentions. So HS2, we've already said you worked there. You're close to it, but was that the smart move?
No, not if you're holding your conference in Manchester. It wasn't. I think if you were holding your conference in Birmingham, say what you like, but literally everyone who left that conference probably got heckled quite badly.
Or got on a train.
All got on a train, yes. Yeah, I don't think it's the right decision. The best bit about HS2 was the Birmingham upwards, so both to Manchester and to Leeds, and to hear that that's been canned, that was where all the savings in travel time to London came from. That was the better connectivity for people living in the north of England, not just to Birmingham but across the Pennines. It's just, it's a big problem for them, and I can completely understand why David Cameron is frustrated. I don't think it was a vanity project. I think it was genuinely striving to do something better that would affect a lot of people's lives, and building capacity on some of the main routes is it. Saying that you're going to do a few more trains is great, but actually they're not going to be high speed. Yes, you're going to electrify some of them, so that will obviously decrease travel time and increase capacity, but I just think it's the wrong decision. I mean, a lot of the money has been spent, and he also announced that HS2 will be taken off the completion of Euston Station. Again, if you believe that the project has been mismanaged so badly that they've had the station taken off them and the route reduced, whose head is rolling for this? How can Mark Thurston stay in his position if he, as head of HS2, has mismanaged this so poorly?
And we had Hugh Merriman, the MP responsible for HS2, the minister, proclaim to Sky News that he was in fact the project manager for HS2. That's what he classed himself as. Therefore, so how's he going to take responsibility for this as well? Don't see him moving from his position anytime soon. I mean, what are the politics of this? Because I mentioned Andy Burnham, it's an absolute gift for him. And I think he mentioned that if they'd have started the other end and were working their way towards London, you can bet your bottom dollar it wouldn't have been cancelled.
No. And realistically, that's the way they should have done it. They should have started in the north and worked southwards, because anybody can see that the travel times between London and Birmingham being reduced by 5-10 minutes here there isn't that impressive. But actually, when you got northwards, it was a significant reduction in travel time. I just think it's really, really short-sighted of them. And the problem is how is any voter in the north of England going to trust the Conservative Party now? This was such a huge project, had so much backing and so much support that, yes, they could have done these other projects, but they haven't started them. When are they going to be started? Not before the next election, because that's 12 months away. What are they going to be voting on? You might as well just smash up that red wall now, because you're not retaining it on this announcement. You've managed to annoy Andy Burnham. You've managed to annoy your own mayor in Birmingham. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Andy Street's not a happy chappy either, the Conservative mayor for the West Midlands. But you mentioned the red wall and the other building analogy, the Northern Powerhouse. I think we'll probably see, as a brand, that brand's up for grabs now, the credibility of the Conservatives using Northern Powerhouse. It was launched in front of Stevenson's rocket, I think, wasn't it? That whole phrase. And I don't think that you'll be able to, the Conservatives will be able to use that with any credibility. It's clearly damaged their prospects of holding on to elements of the red wall. And, if I was a Labour Party, I'd be claiming that brand.
Absolutely.
Because it's a good idea. It was a really good idea, and they just seem to have thrown it away somewhat needlessly, you might say. But the other thing you mentioned earlier on, going back to your old role within HS2, are the communities that have been affected. The communities, in some cases, generations of farmers that have had to have their land and homes compulsory purchased. The impact on those communities. We also, and the people that you would have looked in the eye over those various meetings in village halls. And also the other factor is a whole generation of skills. You mentioned the Skills Academy earlier on to me, that was the engineering college that was made specifically for HS2, and a whole generation of engineers that we're missing out on. I mean, what are your thoughts about those impacts?
I mean, I suppose the college is still there, and will still be training future generations. But obviously, your kind of opportunity to have people working as apprentices on this scheme has just been dramatically reduced, because you've halved it. I mean, nothing is going to compare to it. Not even the railway lines that they've promised to improve or adapt in the north. It's just not the same.
Some of which have already been done, according to some elements of the Manchester press. Yeah, I mean, you're probably getting from the tone of my voice, I'm finding it really hard to be positive about this particular conference, having been to so many myself when I worked for the Conservative Party, as did you. We weren't there this year, and we have guests from all parties and none on this podcast. So we generally play a straight bat, but it's very difficult not to express your opinion when it comes to this particular conference, given the tone of it, some of the language used, given the treatment by some of their own party, and given the announcement today by the Prime Minister. So I'm going to appeal to you here. Cheer me up. What was there to be optimistic about this bright future that Rishi Sunak professes in the speech? Were there any elements of that? I mean, I'll go for one, and that was the focus on veterans.
Yes.
At the beginning, I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I thought Jonny did a cracking job. His delivery, one of the best speeches I've seen him give, quite honestly. So it's fantastic to see veterans front and centre of a headline speech, and that continued with the opening remarks from Rishi Sunak. So 10 out of 10 for that, for me, on that one. But what else was there within there that caught your eye?
To be honest, there was an awful lot packed in. It was an incredibly long speech again. This was my complaint about Davey last week as well. His was very long. Everything was in there, the kitchen sink, the whole shebang. He covered off the economy, education, health, military support to Ukraine, which obviously I felt was missing from Ed Davey's speech last week. The slight perplexing thing that was in there, and I'm just confused by it, given the time frame it covers, is and I agree with him. I do generally agree with this point, that in politics everything is for short-termism and for headlines. Completely agree. His time frame is the more curious part on this. For 30 years we have lived in this short-termism bubble, which I wholeheartedly agree with. But what he doesn't take into account is that the Conservatives have been in elected power for the majority of that time.
Yeah, over two decades of that time. 2/3 that time.
And I don't entirely blame politicians for this. I think, yes, they are to blame, but also the media, and also what the public want. When you and I worked in politics, you know, you have a double-sided A4 leaflet in which to get across all of your messaging, because that is all the electorate can digest, and they don't even digest that. You get a couple of headlines as they're going to the bin to chuck it away. And so I suppose if we want better politics and more nuanced politics and more of a debate, we ourselves have to be more open to receiving, I suppose, more information about everything. And then let's see where it gets us. You know, people are constantly talking about, let's take the NHS, the 5-year plan. 5 years is an incredibly short period of time. It's one term in Parliament, but people are setting budgets realistically longer than that. In business, we know that. You look further ahead than 5 years. You know, yes, you have a 5-year plan, but you're also looking 10 and further ahead still. And so this is what government needs to do, whilst also appreciating that you can't bind any future parliamentary session, although that happens all the time. That is what law is. But yes, so I agreed with him on that. Found it slightly curious the time frame he decided to choose to demonstrate his point. But in general, I do agree with that point, so I thought it was made well. He covered off net zero and how, even though he's repealed on this petrol and diesel cars.
I always think it sounds like a can of pop, that. Net zero.
Yeah, will rot your teeth. Yeah, he's still claimed that the UK can reach net zero by 2030, but that he's saving people money, which is true. Electric cars are very expensive.
But he's the champion of the car, right? Apparently there's a war on motorists. Who started that war? When when was that declared?
When did this happen?
But yeah, kind of again, bit of a contradictory approach there, but at the same time getting reducing rail capacity with HS2. So I'm not going to talk about HS2 anymore.
We're done with HS2.
I'm done with HS2. Done with you, HS2. Never going to get on a train again. Especially you East Midlands Railways. I frequent occasionally. But he also put himself up as the change candidate. The changing man. Big shout out to Paul Weller. But the changing man. And he said change quite a few times, which is curious when you've been in power for 13 years. And you're telling people to change.
Or a year, if you're Rishi.
Or a year, if you're Rishi. Yeah.
Yes. No, it was very interesting language. I suppose as the strategy goes, if you look at the Conservative Party and the Labour Party at the moment on quite a few of the big issues, HS2 aside, they are quite close. There's no huge disagreements, particularly between the major parties. And so setting yourself up as the change candidate, I suppose, sets you aside from Keir Starmer, even though he would technically be the change. So he's essentially trying to set Sir Keir up as continuity, as the establishment, and throw himself out there as this aspirational outlier that's come in. Interesting move.
I remember doing a newspaper review with Peter Cardwell on his show, and it was Keir Starmer gave a speech in London whilst I was on the show, and had to do some quick analysis of it. And in the space of about 15 minutes, 10 minutes, Keir Starmer mentioned change 13 times. I kept a tally chart. I'll be interested to know how many times Rishi said change. But it was curious for an incumbent Prime Minister and party who've been in power for so long to be bringing out the word change. It'd be interesting. And we campaigned, didn't we, on that word change?
Under Cameron, yeah.
Under
Vote
Cameron.
for change.
Vote for change. That was a clear message, and it worked. People were ready for change. Arguably, people might be ready for change now, but perhaps just not the change Rishi Sunak wants necessarily. What else was in there that caught your eye?
Trying to think. Well, there was one thing that wasn't in there.
Okay.
And that was the cost of living crisis. He mentioned his 5 pledges that he launched at the beginning of the year. So the Stop the Boats or Stop the Boots.
Yeah.
The reduce waiting lists in the NHS, and he made another slight announcement today that he would increase, although this is a continuation in my opinion, he would increase the availability of spaces at university for students that wish to study medicine. So obviously increasing the supply of doctors that will go into the NHS, which will at some point in the future reduce your waiting lists. But whether he can do that before the election, questionable. What else did he talk about? I'm trying to think of what his other three things were.
Scrap HS2.
Yeah. But the interesting thing I noticed this week's speech compared to Ed Davey's speech is there wasn't an answer to the question how. Halve inflation. Yeah. How are you doing that? He's just hoping that his current strategies are going to reduce inflation, but he didn't really go into what he's doing to reduce inflation, indeed if he can reduce inflation. There was no mention about the fact that fuel prices are still incredibly high, both at the petrol pumps and gas and electricity still high. They're coming down, but as they're coming down, the kind of standing charge has gone up. So will anybody notice any difference? We'll have to see. So yes, there was a lot of how missing from his speech. There was a few policy announcements, a few questions on how he was going to reach some of his kind of loftier goals. And I actually heard Dame Andrea Leadsom speak a few weeks ago, and I agree with her on this point. 5 points, or 5 pledge points are difficult to remember. I can remember 3.
Yeah.
The list of 3 is the golden rule, in my view. The additional 2, who knows what they're about.
Indeed. So, okay, let's wrap up Rishi. We are ready to wrap up Rishi.
We are.
Let's rate him. We did this last week with Ed and the Lib Dems. Let's go for style out of 10, Rishi's.
Well, it was quite managerial, wasn't it? He decided to stand behind a lectern and deliver his speech, which I fear was probably a combination of notes and auto cue. Very little movement, very little gesticulation. I'm going to go 6 on delivery. Yeah,
non-verbal communication is really important in any communication style, and when you've got a barrier between you, which is a lectern, you lose that element. So perhaps in terms of when Ed Davey delivered his speech, he probably gained some points from the listener by actually having some body language.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on that one. Definitely room for improvement on that. And when it came to the content, out of 10?
I'm going to go for 7.5. So he did a similar thing to Ed Davey, and I haven't mentioned this. He talked about his family, and he linked back to his grandfather and how proud he was of when he became an MP. But again, that was dropped randomly into the middle of his speech, which was a very long speech, a lot of content, a lot of stuff thrown in. Could have better delivered it at the beginning, but maybe he thought that's what his wife was doing, so he didn't necessarily need to do it. So yeah, 7.5, I think.
Okay, and lastly, length?
Too long.
Yeah, out of 10. What's 2 out of 10.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah, a score would be good.
I'll score, yeah. You know what, I'll go 4 out of 10. A bit too long, but he did get a lot in.
Craig Revel Horwood returns at the end there. Okay, so that wraps that up. So all in all, this conference has been a bit of a mixed bag. Did you miss not being there this year? No,
to be honest, on I think it was Sunday or Monday, I forgot it was on. It was only when I watched the news that I went, oh, yeah.
A few years ago, you'd been packing your bag a week before, weren't you? Excited.
I'd have been devastated.
It's like Christmas. It's like Christmas or Glastonbury for political geeks. Yeah,
it is. It was always quite nice because it was always quite a good opportunity to catch up with people from across the country that you kind of work alongside but you don't see often, and that was the nice thing. And it was always a real sense of like bringing everyone together, and it's a good opportunity to swap ideas about campaigning or event planning and, you know, sharing good practice. That's kind of what you miss, and the camaraderie. And if I'm being honest, you know, fairly infrequently did I go into the main conference hall to listen to the keynote speeches. I always try to get into the leader's speech, although we did give up a couple of times, didn't we? Although once we were sat near Ken from Corrie, and that was lovely.
That was great, that was.
That was a highlight. Yeah, I think I haven't missed it, which has surprised me, to be honest.
Okay, so just to wrap out this week's episode, let's go for some quick fire questions. Favourite conference town venue?
Blackpool, dead easy that one. I love Blackpool.
Why?
Everyone was so welcoming. And I used to stay in a little B&B that was literally 3 steps to the front door of the Winter Gardens, which was incredible. I mean, you'd never get that now. And just the atmosphere was different because you kind of felt like you were in a bubble, and everything's better by the seaside.
Yep. Okay. Favourite fringe thing that you've been to and why, or an event? So fringe events for our listeners are outside of the main hall, run by charities, businesses, pressure groups, and they lay on little mini focus groups essentially with panel discussions, or they can be a bit more social. What's been your favourite one?
Oh, this is going to be a really big throwback for you. It was the Freedom Zone, which I went to because I worked for, as previously mentioned, Roger Helmer, and he had a stand there, and Ian Dale did a kind of event where you basically had to stand up and kind of give a speech on an issue for a couple of minutes and then answer questions, and then he basically rated you, and that was really good fun.
Yeah, you did.
I hate public speaking as well. I don't know why I did it.
But you put yourself out there.
It was really good fun.
And you spoke on the same platform, a lineup, as no less the current Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly.
Oh, yes.
Who back then was a London Assembly member, relatively unknown.
Yep.
So before that, a famous moment. And I never forget, that was the first time I heard him speak, and I was so impressed. I remember he said to the activists, and this was when the Conservatives were in opposition, don't get angry with the opposition, get even.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting message. And here he is now, Foreign Secretary. Whatever happened to that bloke. And on James Cleverly, it was very kind of him last year. I remember when I bumped into him in the corridor, and he was like, how's your leg? He remembered I'd had a motorcycle accident. So super nice guy, nice guy.
Yeah.
So that's I thought you were going to say, when I said favourite fringe event, I thought you were going to say, well, obviously campaign force,
obviously,
yeah.
yes,
and the events that we ran in previous, so which are available, some of which are available on this podcast. So do listen back to those. I think we'll leave you alone on the quick fire there.
Thank you.
But Lydia, thank you so much for your insights on all things HS2 related. Probably the last time I was about. Hopefully talk about HS2, certainly this week. Thank you for your insights on conference. It's been really interesting. And thank you, a big shout out to the Conservative Friends of the Armed Forces, who ran 4 events at Conservative Conference this year. So well done, James Clark and Ed McGuinness and the team there. You've done a phenomenal job. Hope it went well. I know that lots of our Campaign Force supporters and listeners of this podcast went along to those too. So for any of you of a blue disposition, do check out Conservative Friends of the Armed Forces, of which we are very good friends with, likewise with our counterparts in Labour and Lib Dems. So without further ado, that wraps up this week's episode of Gogglebox. Behind the Politics with Veterans in Politics. Don't forget to check out next week. We'll be returning back here with some insight in Sir Keir Starmer's speech. Ooh, could be the future Prime Minister. Ooh. Who knows? The suspense. And don't forget, the Labour Friends of the Forces do have events going on at Labour Conference as well, so do check out those. Louise Harbour, a previous guest of the show, has been organising those too. So thank you for listening. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and we shall see you next week, won't we, Lydia?
We will.
You going to come back?
Yeah, go on.
Well, we are in our house, so
it's not taken a lot for me to be here, is it? Let's be fair.
Not really. Right. Thanks very much, and don't forget, stand up and serve again. Enjoy. See you next week. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, hit subscribe now. Alternatively, you can support our mission by checking out in the show notes below, where you can rate, donate, or become our mate. Thank you.